Have you ever stopped to actually think about what a feeling is? I mean, really think about it? We experience them every single waking moment. They literally dictate our choices, our relationships, and our overall sense of well-being. But despite how intimately familiar we are with our own joy, anger, or sadness, the actual underlying mechanics of these experiences, well, they're profoundly complex. So let's dive right into this explainer and explore the fascinating concept of affect, which is the clinical term for what we casually call feelings or emotions. Today, we're looking strictly at the psychoanalytic perspective, tracing how some of the most brilliant minds have attempted to decode the very architecture of human emotion. To make sense of this deeply complex topic, we've organized our analysis into 6 clear steps. We'll be defining the undefinable, looking at the evolution of affect, exploring affect as communication, unpacking the 7 dimensions of emotion, tackling the unconscious emotion debate, and finally, looking at when emotions go wrong. Let's jump straight into section 1, defining the indefinable. Now, you'd probably assume that a field entirely dedicated to the human mind would have a simple, universally agreed upon definition for feelings, right? Well, not quite. To ground ourselves in the psychoanalytic perspective, we really need to know the formal terminology. When you read the literature and see the word affect, you should know that this is just the customary term used to describe what the rest of us simply call an emotion or a feeling. It's essentially the clinical wrapper for that raw, internal human experience. But trying to get more specific than that is incredibly difficult. As Leo Rangel pointed out back in 1995, even top psychoanalysts struggle to pin down exactly what these terms mean in a way everyone can agree on. He noted that differentiation between these terms has been attempted from time to time, but honestly hasn't led to any satisfactory or generally accepted formulation. Because affect is such a fluid, deeply subjective experience, the psychoanalytic perspective hasn't been static. It's had to evolve in tandem with the overall progress of psychoanalytic theory itself. Since definitions kind of failed us there, let's look at history. This brings us to section 2, the evolution of affect. If we can't perfectly define it today, we can at least trace how the brightest minds have thought about it over the past century. Following David Rappaport's 1953 framework, we can see a really clear progression. Back in the 1890s, affect was equated directly with energy. You can think of the strangulation of affect during this era almost like a pressure cooker. The theory was that if emotional energy was blocked or strangled, it literally caused clinical symptoms. It had to erupt somewhere. Then, moving into the early 20th century, from 1900 to 1923, the prevailing thought evolved. Affects were seen as physiological discharges into the interior of the body, dictating both how we express and internally experience emotions. Finally, by 1923 to 1926, psychoanalysis broadened its view. Experts began looking at affects from multiple vantage points, associating their development with an increasing dominance of the ego. Basically, as our ego, our conscious sense of self-control, matured, it got much better at handling and channeling these intense affective energies. But the theory definitely didn't stop in the 1920s. This brings us to section 3, affect as communication. The pressure cooker metaphor was really just the beginning of the story. As theory progressed, the crucial realization was that emotions aren't just raw energy. They're actually highly complex communication tools. Theorists like Emd, Mahler, and Spitz came to regard affects as primary communicative pathways between ourselves and our objects, which, by the way, is just the psychoanalytic term for other people or external things. Think of it as the emotional bridge connecting you to the world. Furthermore, heavyweights like Kernberg and Klein argue that affects are the literal building blocks of how we mentally represent ourselves and others. By the 1990s, Kernberg was even positing that affects act as the very organizers of our psychological drives. They literally form the structural foundation of our inner world, shaping our deepest desires and motivations. Having traced the history, we can now break down the phenomenal complexity of how affects actually manifest in our minds. Let's look at section 4, 7 dimensions of emotion. Because beyond those high-level historical phases, there's a complex day-to-day reality to how we experience feeling. Psychoanalysts use 7 phenomenological binaries to evaluate exactly what we're feeling, which really proves just how multidimensional human emotion truly is. It's never simply about being happy or sad. A clinician has to ask, is this affect primitive, like a raw survival urge, or is it more advanced and nuanced? As Glover noted in 1939, are we looking at a single feeling or a tangled, mixed emotion? Is the feeling fixed stubbornly in place, or is it labile, meaning it rapidly shifts and changes? They also look at instinct. Is the feeling building up an instinctual tension, or is it the relief and release of that tension? We can even separate deep, drive-related affects, like profound love or hate,
from ego-related affects, like the simple pleasure of mastering a new skill. There's also the brilliant question of defense. Is the feeling motivating you to put up psychological walls, or is the emotion itself the wall? And finally, perhaps the deepest binary of all, conscious versus unconscious affects.
Let's pull on that very last thread and ask a pretty wild question. Can a feeling exist if you aren't conscious of it? Welcome to Section 5, the unconscious emotion debate. This is perhaps one of the most fascinating controversies in the history of psychology, and it completely changes how we view our inner depths. On one side, we have the founder of psychoanalysis himself, Sigmund Freud. Now, according to Rangel, Freud's stance on this was notoriously inconsistent. He mostly maintained that for an affect to truly be an affect, it had to be conscious, like you had to actually feel it in the moment to validate its existence. Yet, he'd occasionally imply the exact opposite might be true. We can contrast Freud directly against Sidney Pulver's bold theories from the 1970s. Pulver suggested that affects absolutely can exist in the unconscious. He proposed they wait down there as fully formed repressed contents, or they exist as latent predispositions, just quietly waiting to congeal into a particular emotional response the second they're triggered. Finally, we have to ask why this matters in real life. Let's move to our final section, when emotions go wrong. Understanding the mechanics of affect is absolutely crucial, because when the machinery malfunctions, the human suffering is profound. To see this clearly, we can look at the 1999 clinical findings of Ronnie A. Krauss and Jorg Merton, who brilliantly illustrated the difference between neuroses and severe psychopathology. In neuroses, the patient suffers from an absolute excess of conflictual affects. Their mind is essentially a crowded, noisy room of battling feelings. But in cases of severe psychopathology, the affective system responds completely differently. Instead of an excess, there is a terrifying restriction of affect. The entire emotional system shuts down until one single negative lead affect takes total, solitary control over the mind. It's a dark and isolating state for sure, but mapping out this mechanism gives clinicians a vital starting point for actual treatment. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to deeply ponder about your own unconscious mind. What unfelt emotions are driving your actions today? Based on everything we've uncovered, from repressed contents waiting in the dark to hidden affects organizing your deepest drives, how much of your daily life is being piloted by feelings you haven't even acknowledged yet? It's a lot to think about. Thank you so much for exploring the incredible psychology of emotion with me today. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.